December 9, 2023. The courtroom fell silent as 17-year-old Ethan Crumbley stood before the judge. A boy who once moved unnoticed through the halls of Oxford High School was about to hear a sentence that would define the rest of his life. What the judge delivered that day was not simply punishment. It was a declaration, a decision that many believe is more severe than death itself. When the hearing ended, Ethan was led away from the public eye and into a system designed for grown men hardened by decades of confinement. A system with no forgiveness for someone convicted of attacking a school. Outside those walls, the world continued to debate his fate. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole. The harshest penalty Michigan law allows. A punishment imposed not on a man, but on someone who was only 15 years old when the violence occurred. The judge stated plainly that Ethan Crumbley would never walk free. To many, execution would have been more just a single ending instead of a lifetime of breathing behind concrete and steel. Some argue that keeping him alive is mercy, that decades in prison offer more compassion than a final moment. But that belief ignores what this sentence truly means. And by the end of this video, you will understand why living out his days inside those walls may be far more devastating than death itself. Share your thoughts below. Should a teenager ever receive life without parole? But before you decide, you need to understand where the system sent him and why that choice sealed his future. And before we continue, subscribe now. Long before the sentence was spoken in open court, the trajectory of his life had already begun to fracture in quiet, almost invisible ways. The early signs did not arrive as a single alarming event. They surfaced gradually, scattered across ordinary days, subtle enough to be overlooked but persistent enough to form a pattern. School notebooks became the first place where something deeper revealed itself. Pages once meant for assignments began filling with violent imagery, distorted figures, and handwritten phrases that hinted at a mind struggling to separate internal chaos from external reality. Teachers would later recall drawings that felt unsettling rather than immature, images that lingered long after the page was turned. At home, journals contained references to unseen presences, shapes moving through rooms, and thoughts that felt intrusive and uncontrollable. These were not fleeting fears. They were recurring themes, repeating with increasing intensity. What initially appeared as adolescent distress slowly evolved into something more troubling. Reports emerged of cruelty toward animals, incidents that suggested a growing disconnect from empathy and consequence. Each episode, when viewed alone, could be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. Together, they painted a picture of emotional deterioration. The loss of his closest friend deepened the isolation. With that connection severed, he withdrew further inward. Soon after, the family dog died, removing the last consistent source of comfort in a household already strained by tension and neglect. None of these moments triggered immediate intervention. They accumulated quietly, stacking pressure without release. As his internal world grew darker, an external factor entered that would permanently alter the outcome. On Black Friday, his father purchased a Sig Sauer 9mm pistol. The transaction itself appeared routine, legal, and unremarkable. But it placed a lethal instrument within reach of a teenager already unraveling. No safeguards followed the purchase. The firearm was not secured. No effort was made to separate access from vulnerability. Within days, the thoughts that had remained confined to sketches and private writings began taking form. Planning replaced rumination. Obsession sharpened into intent. Access transformed imagination into possibility. Despite mounting warning signs, no authority recognized how little time remained. November 30th, 2021 began with the illusion of normalcy. Hallways buzzed with routine movement. Classrooms settled into familiar rhythms. Beneath that surface, however, the system came dangerously close to stopping what was about to unfold. The first alert occurred when a teacher noticed him searching for ammunition during class. This was not casual curiosity. The search focused on specific calibers and equipment. The school attempted contact with his mother. A voicemail was left. An email followed. No response came. The day continued uninterrupted. A second warning emerged shortly after. Another teacher discovered a worksheet covered in disturbing imagery. A gun, a wounded figure, words expressing mental anguish, including phrases that indicated intrusive thoughts and emotional overwhelm. Staff responded by removing him from class and bringing him to a private room. His parents were summoned and shown the drawing. Administrators urged immediate mental health intervention, emphasizing urgency within 48 hours. Yet, despite the gravity of the situation, no one insisted he leave the school. His parents declined to take him home. Bound by procedural limitations, the school allowed him to return to class carrying his backpack. A backpack that already contained the pistol purchased 4 days earlier. That decision marked the final opportunity for prevention. It passed quietly, unnoticed in its significance. The final hour before the attack unfolded without visible disruption. Surveillance footage later showed him entering a restroom at 12:51 p.m. The movement appeared ordinary, but behind the closed door, preparation ended and execution began. He emerged moments later with the weapon drawn. The actions that followed were not random. They were deliberate. He moved through the hallway with purpose, firing toward classrooms and students in a controlled pattern. Panic erupted. Alarms sounded. Students fled. Staff called for help. Deputies rushed toward the scene. Within minutes, the damage was irreversible. When law enforcement confronted him, he did not resist. He placed the weapon on the ground and surrendered. The transition from threat to custody happened so quickly that many never witnessed it. One moment, the school was consumed by fear. The next, a silent teenager was escorted away. Surveillance footage preserved every movement, later forming the foundation of the prosecution's case. Within hours, the narrative shifted. The boy was now the youngest mass shooter in United States history, facing terrorism charges. As investigators examined his belongings, a deeper level of preparation emerged. Journal entries revealed fixation rather than impulse. The tone was detached, analytical. Phone records showed research into ammunition, firearm mechanics, and emergency response times. Searches included sentencing laws, particularly distinctions between juvenile and adult penalties. Prosecutors argued this demonstrated awareness of consequence. Each discovery reinforced the conclusion that the attack was planned. Not spontaneous, not reactive, methodical. The legal system moved swiftly. He was charged as an adult with terrorism causing death, multiple counts of first-degree murder, assault with intent to murder, and firearm violations. An insanity defense was briefly considered, then withdrawn. On October 24, 2022, he pleaded guilty to all charges. The courtroom absorbed the weight of that admission. There would be no trial, no defense narrative, only consequence. Sentencing marked the end of legal debate and the beginning of lived consequence. When the judge delivered life without the possibility of parole, the courtroom fell into a silence that carried beyond its walls. The ruling acknowledged the complexities of adolescent development, but ultimately concluded that the severity of the crimes outweighed every mitigating factor. With that declaration, his future was sealed. He was transferred immediately into the custody of the Michigan Department of Corrections. As a minor entering the adult prison system, his experience diverged sharply from that of adult inmates. State regulations required complete separation from the general population. Isolation was not a disciplinary measure. It was mandatory. The cell he entered was small, concrete, and stripped of stimulation. A steel bed frame, a narrow window, 1 hour outside the cell each day under supervision. 23 hours of stillness became routine. Every movement was monitored. Cameras tracked posture, pacing, sleep cycles, and periods of inactivity. Psychological evaluations began almost immediately. Clinicians assessed comprehension, emotional response, and behavioral stability. Reports documented fluctuations in affect, withdrawal, and difficulty maintaining eye contact. Access to materials was limited. Yet despite restrictions, he found ways to consume violent content on a monitored tablet. Videos depicting school attacks surfaced during review. The discovery alarmed the court. It suggested fixation rather than remorse. Judges later cited this behavior as evidence that fascination with violence persisted even after sentencing. Inside solitary confinement, time behaved differently. Days blurred. Silence pressed inward. Without peers or meaningful interaction, the environment began reshaping cognitive function. For adolescents, isolation does more than restrict movement. It disrupts development. Research has shown that prolonged separation during formative years alters emotional regulation, perception, and identity formation. Sleep patterns deteriorate. Concentration fractures. Sensory distortions emerge. Silence becomes oppressive. Ordinary sounds feel threatening. For someone already displaying psychological instability, these effects intensified. Evaluations reflected this progression. Clinicians noted prolonged withdrawal, inconsistent emotional responses, and difficulty grounding thoughts. The confinement was not violent, but it was relentless. Every hour reinforced immobility. Control shifted entirely to routine. Meal delivery, cell checks, scheduled hygiene. These small structures intended to maintain order instead emphasized loss of agency. Without access to juvenile programming or social interaction, the capacity to imagine a future diminished. Over time, adaptation occurred not toward growth but survival. After nearly 2 years in county isolation, transfer to state custody approached. In December 2023, he was transported to the Michigan Department of Corrections for intake processing. The procedures were clinical and impersonal. Medical screenings, classification interviews, risk assessments. As a young lifer convicted of terrorism and multiple homicides, he was automatically labeled high risk. His age created vulnerability. His crime created danger. Placement in general population was deemed impossible. Administrators evaluated threats from other inmates, examining institutional hierarchies and cultural codes. The conclusion was immediate. Segregation was necessary for survival. Thumb Correctional Facility became the intermediary. The environment was more industrial, less personal. Routines tightened. Time in cell increased. Exceptions decreased. The permanence of his sentence began to materialize through layers of security and reinforced doors. Turning 18 dissolved the final legal protections of juvenile status. On April 28, 2024, he was transferred again, this time to Oaks Correctional Facility in Manistee. Classified as Level 2, Oaks housed an older inmate population with decades of institutional experience. In this environment, youth was a liability. His offense placed him at the lowest tier of the prison hierarchy. Crimes involving schools and children carry intense stigma. Even inmates convicted of violent offenses distance themselves from such acts. Reputation governs survival. His reputation preceded him. Media coverage ensured anonymity was impossible. Administrators responded by restricting movement. Escorts became mandatory. Communal activities were eliminated. Life narrowed further. Survival depended on isolation. Inside Oaks, danger was constant but invisible. Violence functioned as currency. High-profile offenders carried value. A single lapse in supervision could prove fatal. The threat did not diminish with time. It waited. Meals were delivered. Recreation was solitary. General population was unattainable. The boundaries surrounding him were not privileges. They were barriers constructed from risk. Isolation protected his body but left his mind exposed. In silence, awareness intensified. The permanence of his actions replayed without distraction. For lives lost, 7 futures altered. Community scarred. This awareness became an internal sentence no external punishment could exceed. Confinement removed distraction but did not remove memory. Inside isolation, the events of November 30th remained fixed, replaying without variation. Unlike inmates who attribute their crimes to impulse or circumstance, he carried the weight of planning and deliberate choice. That distinction shaped every psychological evaluation. Counselors documented recurring patterns of rumination and emotional withdrawal. The knowledge that his actions permanently altered an entire town became a constant presence. The impact extended beyond victims and survivors. It reached into his own family. In an unprecedented legal development, prosecutors charged his parents with involuntary manslaughter. The argument centered on negligence, failure to secure the firearm, ignoring warning signs, dismissing concerns raised by school officials. Courts across the country followed the case closely, aware of its implications. When convictions were secured, the consequences reverberated through his confinement. Both parents were incarcerated in separate facilities. The family unit dissolved completely. From his cell, he learned that the people responsible for his upbringing were now inmates themselves. This did not bring comfort. It reinforced isolation. Appeals were filed and denied. The legal system affirmed the verdicts. The possibility of reunion outside prison walls vanished. Communication, if any, occurred through monitored channels. The collapse of the family unfolded slowly through hearings and motions, but its psychological impact was immediate. Whatever remained of his adolescence was spent knowing that his actions had dismantled every remaining connection. With family gone and future erased, the question of punishment resurfaced. Life or death. Execution ends existence in a single moment. Life without parole stretches consequence indefinitely. For someone sentenced before adulthood, the distinction becomes profound. Execution compresses accountability. A life sentence expands it across decades. For him, permanence defines punishment. There is no parole board, no eligibility hearing, no calendar to mark progress. Each morning begins with certainty. The system has already decided where he will die. That certainty erodes hope, the psychological mechanism that sustains many long-term inmates. Legal debates surrounding juvenile sentencing often emphasize brain development and potential for change. Courts have questioned whether adolescents possess the maturity required for irreversible punishment. In this case, those arguments failed. The court concluded that planning, harm, and public impact outweighed mitigation. The ruling declared irrevocability. Death sentences involve prolonged appeals. Life without parole eliminates that process. There is no clemency campaign, no countdown. The punishment becomes routine rather than anticipatory. Many argue that the absence of an endpoint intensifies suffering. Public perception compounds this reality. Forgiveness is unlikely. Forgetting is impossible. Media memory ensures continued notoriety. Remorse does not erase reputation. Incarceration becomes more than physical confinement. It becomes social erasure. Reintegration is impossible because no future exists beyond the institution. The years ahead stretch unbroken. If he lives an average lifespan, he will spend 60 years inside. Every developmental milestone will occur behind walls. Early adulthood, middle age, old age. Relationships will be limited to supervised interactions. Careers will not exist. Independent decision-making will remain absent. Time will be measured by headcounts rather than experiences. Programs prioritize inmates with release dates. For lifers, progress is symbolic. Participation does not alter outcome. Monotony defines existence. Days repeat with precision. Over time, repetition erodes identity. Aging introduces new hardship. Health declines. Mobility decreases. Without family or support networks, vulnerability increases. Growing old in prison magnifies isolation. By the time he reaches advanced age, the world beyond the walls will be unrecognizable. Technology, culture, and society will have shifted without him. Inside, little will change. This static existence becomes its own sentence. Justice, in this context, resists simple definition. Some view life without parole as accountability extended across time. Others see it as punishment devoid of redemption. The case forces confrontation with morality, responsibility, and the boundaries of punishment imposed before adulthood. The question remains unresolved. Is a lifetime of isolation harsher than death? The final dimension of his sentence unfolds not through policy or procedure, but through endurance. Life without parole is not a single moment of reckoning. It is an accumulation of ordinary days stripped of variation. Each morning begins the same way. The cell, the schedule, the certainty. Over time, the absence of choice becomes the defining feature of existence. Inmates with release dates measure progress through milestones. For lifers, time loses direction. Without an endpoint, years blur into a continuous present. Psychological studies on long-term confinement identify this phenomenon as temporal flattening. The future ceases to function as motivation. Instead, survival becomes the primary objective. For someone sentenced as a teenager, this effect is magnified. Identity formation, typically shaped through exploration and social feedback, occurs instead within rigid boundaries. Mistakes cannot be outgrown. Growth does not alter outcome. The past remains permanently attached to the present. Counseling sessions revisit the same conclusions. Annual assessments document the same reality. The impact of the crime will outlive the offender. This knowledge becomes internalized. Remorse transforms from emotion into condition. It does not resolve, persists. Public discourse often frames punishment through severity, length of sentence, conditions of confinement, but endurance introduces a different metric. The slow erosion of self, the gradual narrowing of possibility. Over decades, hope becomes abstract. Inmates describe a shift from longing to resignation. The mind adapts not by healing, but by reducing expectation. This adaptation protects against despair but extracts a cost. Emotional range contracts. Motivation diminishes. Life becomes maintenance rather than experience. Aging accelerates these effects. Physical decline intersects with institutional limitations. Medical care addresses survival, not comfort. Without family advocacy, vulnerability increases. Elderly inmates rely on staff for basic needs. Autonomy diminishes further. Death, when it arrives, occurs within the same walls that defined adulthood. There is no transition, no return, only conclusion. The debate over justice often seeks equivalence. Does punishment match harm? In cases involving juveniles, the question becomes more complex. Accountability intersects with development. Society assigns responsibility while acknowledging immaturity. Life without parole resolves this tension by prioritizing consequence over potential. It removes uncertainty. The sentence declares that change, even if possible, is irrelevant. For some, this offers closure. For others, it raises ethical concern. The system does not ask whether redemption matters. It decides that it does not. The story forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Prevention failed. Intervention came too late. Punishment filled the void. Whether that punishment constitutes justice remains subjective. What is certain is permanence. A teenager entered the system. An old man will die within it. The walls will remain. The routines will persist. The memory of the crime will not fade. The question lingers beyond the case. How society defines justice reveals what it values. Severity, duration, finality, or the possibility of change. There is no resolution that restores what was lost. For lives ended, many more altered, the sentence ensures that consequence continues indefinitely. Whether that outcome represents justice or despair depends on perspective. What remains undeniable is that life without parole is not merely a sentence. It is a condition, one that unfolds slowly, relentlessly, without reprieve. And for someone who entered it before adulthood, it becomes the only life they will ever know. And that leaves us with the question no court can fully resolve. What does justice actually mean in a case like this? Is it defined by how harsh the sentence is, by how long it lasts, or by the damage done long before adulthood ever began? Some will argue this punishment represents accountability extended across an entire lifetime, a weight meant to mirror the lives that were taken. Others will see it as a sentence that removes any possibility of growth, sealing a teenager inside a future with no escape and no redemption. There is no answer that satisfies everyone. What remains undeniable is that this case forces us to examine morality, responsibility, and where society draws the line between protection and punishment. Share your perspective below now.